Sometimes the most desperate moments of our lives become the doorways to our greatest transformations. When Sarah Martinez clutched her last $20 bill in the parking lot of Murphy's Diner, watching her beaten-up Honda refuse to start one more time, she had no idea that answering a simple newspaper ad would lead her into a world where million-dollar cattle deals were made with handshakes. Where the sunrise over endless grasslands would heal wounds she didn't know she carried, and where a gruff rancher with calloused hands would teach her that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the most beautiful beginnings. This is the true story of how a single mother's search for work became a journey of rediscovering herself, finding unexpected love, and building a life she never dared to dream possible. It's about the courage it takes to start over when everything seems lost and the magic that happens when two broken souls find healing in each other's company, under the vast Montana sky. Sarah Martinez stared at the eviction notice taped to her apartment door, the red letters swimming before her tired eyes. 30 days. That's all the time she had left before she and her 8-year-old daughter Emma would be out on the street. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked pavement of the Riverside Apartments, a place that had never been much to look at but had been home for the past 3 years. She crumpled the notice and shoved it into her worn purse, right next to the stack of rejection letters that seemed to grow thicker each day. 6 months since she'd lost her job at the insurance office. 6 months of watching her savings disappear like water through her fingers. 6 months of putting on a brave face for Emma while her world crumbled around her. The Honda coughed and wheezed as she turned the key, finally rumbling to life after the third try. Sarah whispered a small prayer of gratitude. The car was on its last legs, much like everything else in her life, but it still ran. That had to count for something. Emma bounced in the back seat, her school backpack clutched against her chest, completely unaware of the storm clouds gathering over their lives. At 8 years old, she still believed her mother could fix anything, solve any problem. Sarah caught her daughter's eyes in the rearview mirror and forced a smile. Ready for school, baby? Can we get pancakes after school today, Mama? The kind with blueberries that you make special? Sarah's heart clenched. They'd been living on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches for weeks. Blueberries were a luxury they couldn't afford, but how could she explain that to a child who still believed in endless possibilities? We'll see, sweetie. Let's get you to school first. The drive to Riverside Elementary was short, but Sarah used every minute to scan the neighborhoods for help-wanted signs. Martinez Landscaping had a small sign out front, but she'd already tried there twice. The owner, Mr. Fire. Martinez wasn't related despite sharing her last name, and he'd made it clear that he wasn't hiring anyone without experience. The gas station on 5th Street had taken down their help-wanted sign last week. She'd been too late for that one too. After dropping Emma off with promises of a fun afternoon that Sarah had no idea how she'd deliver on, she drove to the public library. The internet at home had been shut off 2 months ago, but the library offered free computer access for 2 hours a day. Sarah had become a regular fixture there, hunched over the outdated computers, applying for jobs that seemed to disappear as quickly as they were posted. Mrs. Chen, the elderly librarian, nodded sympathetically as Sarah walked past. The whole staff knew her story by now. They'd watched her transform from a confident office worker in pressed slacks and blouses to a woman wearing the same 3 outfits in rotation, her professional wardrobe sold months ago to pay for groceries. The job search websites yielded the same disappointing results as always. Administrative assistant positions that required 5 years of experience for entry-level pay. Retail jobs that wouldn't even cover childcare costs. Customer service positions that demanded evening and weekend hours, impossible for a single mother with no family support system. Sarah rubbed her temples, feeling a familiar headache building behind her eyes. She was educated, experienced, and willing to work harder than anyone. So why couldn't she catch a break? Why did every door seem to slam shut just as she approached it? That's when she noticed the woman at the computer next to her. An elderly lady with silver hair and kind eyes, reading what looked like classified ads in an actual newspaper. The sight was so unusual in the digital age that it caught Sarah's attention. "Excuse me," Sarah said quietly, not wanting to disturb anyone else in the library. "Is that the local paper? I haven't seen anyone read the classifieds in print in years." The woman looked up and smiled. "Oh, honey, you'd be surprised what you can find in here that never makes it online. I'm Dorothy Webb. I used to run the employment office downtown before I retired. Old habits die hard, I suppose." "I'm Sarah. I've been looking for work for months now. Everything online seems to require experience I don't have or pays less than minimum wage." Dorothy studied Sarah's face with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades matching people with jobs. 1. "You have that look, dear. The one that comes from hitting wall after wall. What kind of work did you do before? Office management mostly. Filing, scheduling, customer service. I was with Hartwell Insurance for 4 years before they downsized. And now you're looking at retail and fast food? Sarah nodded, embarrassment heating her cheeks. I'll take anything honest at this point. I have a daughter to support. Dorothy folded the newspaper and turned to face her fully. Let me tell you something, dear. Sometimes the best opportunities are the ones that don't look like opportunities at first glance. Sometimes they're hiding in places where other people won't think to look. She opened the newspaper to the classified section and pointed to a small ad tucked between listings for used furniture and yard sales. See this one here? Ranch hand needed. Room and board included. Must be hardworking and reliable. Experience preferred, but will train right person. Call J. Morgan. Most people would skip right over this because they think ranch work is just for cowboys and country folks. Sarah read the ad twice, frowning. But I don't know anything about ranch work. I've never even been on a horse. That's what will train right person means, honey. And look here, room and board included. That means a place to live and food to eat. For someone in your situation, that's worth more than most salaries. The idea seemed impossible. Sarah had grown up in Phoenix, spent her whole adult life in cities and suburbs. The closest she'd come to farm animals was the petting zoo at the county fair. But as Dorothy's words sank in, she realized the woman was right. Room and board meant no rent, no utility bills, no grocery costs. It would give her a chance to get back on her feet, to save money for the first time in months. Where is this ranch? Sarah asked, already knowing she was going to make the call. About 40 miles north of here, up in cattle country. Beautiful area if you like wide open spaces and clean air. I knew Joe Morgan's father back in the day. Good people, the Morgans. They've been ranching that land for 3 generations. Sarah pulled out her phone, checking the time. Emma wouldn't be out of school for another 5 hours. That would give her time to call, maybe even drive out to see the place if they were interested in meeting her. You really think they'd consider someone like me? Dorothy reached over and patted her hand gently. Dear, I think you'd be surprised what you're capable of when you stop limiting yourself to what you think you should be doing and start focusing on what you need to be doing. That ranch might be exactly what you and your little girl need. Sarah copied down the phone number with shaking hands. The possibility of a real solution, a way out of the spiral she'd been trapped in, made her almost dizzy with hope. But hope had disappointed her so many times lately that she was afraid to trust it. She found a quiet corner of the library and dialed the number. It rang 3 times before a gruff male voice answered. Morgan Ranch. Hi, I'm calling about the ad in the paper. The position for a ranch hand? There was a pause, and Sarah could hear wind in the background, the distant lowing of cattle. You have experience with cattle? No, sir, but the ad said you'd train the right person. I'm a hard worker, very reliable. I need this job. Another pause. Sarah held her breath. You available to come out today for an interview? I'll be straight with you, miss. Ranch work isn't easy, and it isn't glamorous, but if you're serious about learning and you're not afraid of hard work, I'm willing to talk. I can be there this afternoon. Could you give me directions? As she wrote down the complicated series of turns and landmarks that would lead her to Morgan Ranch, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Genuine hope. Not the desperate kind that came from applying for jobs she didn't really want, but the real thing. The kind that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, her luck was about to change. She spent the rest of the morning at the library, researching ranch work and cattle ranching on the free computers. The more she read, the more overwhelming it seemed. Vaccinating animals, managing breeding schedules, operating heavy machinery, working in all kinds of weather. But she also read about the lifestyle, about people who found peace and purpose in working with animals and land, about the satisfaction that came from honest physical work. By the time she left to pick up Emma from school, Sarah had made up her mind. She was going to that ranch, and she was going to convince Joe Morgan to give her a chance. She had to. The alternative, homelessness and failure, wasn't an option. Not for her daughter, and not for herself. Emma chatted excitedly about her day as they drove home, talking about art class and the story her teacher had read about a little girl who lived on a farm. Sarah took it as a sign. Maybe Dorothy was right. Maybe the best opportunities really did come disguised as something completely unexpected. That afternoon, as she changed into her most professional outfit, a navy blazer and slacks that had seen better days but still looked respectable, Sarah caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at her was thinner than she'd been 6 months ago, with worry lines that hadn't been there before. But there was something else too, something she hadn't seen in a while. Determination. She was about to take the biggest risk of her life, driving 40 miles into unfamiliar territory to ask a stranger for a job she'd never imagined doing. But as she applied a thin layer of lipstick and brushed her dark hair back into a neat ponytail, Sarah realized that she wasn't the same woman who had lost her job 6 months ago. That woman had been comfortable, maybe even a little complacent. This woman, the one standing in the cracked mirror of a dingy apartment bathroom, had been tested by life and was still standing. The drive to Morgan Ranch would take her through country she'd never seen before, toward a future she couldn't predict. But for the first time in months, Sarah Martinez was moving towards something instead of running away from her problems. And that felt like the beginning of everything. The landscape changed gradually as Sarah drove north, the suburban sprawl giving way to rolling hills dotted with grazing cattle. She'd never paid much attention to the countryside during her few trips outside the city, but now she found herself really looking at it. The grass was greener than she'd expected, even in late autumn, and the sky seemed bigger somehow, stretching endlessly in all directions without the interruption of buildings and billboards. Her phone's GPS had lost signal 20 minutes ago, leaving her to navigate by the handwritten directions Joe Morgan had given her. Turn right at the red barn with the faded Coca-Cola sign. Left at the fork where the old oak tree leaned over the road. Continue until you see the white mailbox with Morgan painted in black letters. Each landmark appeared exactly as he'd described it, and Sarah began to understand that this was a world where people still gave directions based on things that had been there for decades. It was oddly comforting, this sense of permanence in a life that had felt so unstable lately. The Morgan Ranch mailbox stood at the entrance to a long gravel driveway that wound between wooden fence posts connected by neat strands of barbed wire. Black cattle with white faces grazed peacefully in the pastures on either side, occasionally lifting their heads to watch her car pass. In the distance, she could see a cluster of buildings. A 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch, a massive red barn, and several smaller structures she couldn't identify. Sarah's palms were sweating as she parked beside a dusty pickup truck near the house. The Honda looked ridiculously small and urban next to the ranch truck, which was splattered with mud and had hay bales stacked in its bed. She checked her reflection one more time in the rearview mirror, smoothing her hair and straightening her blazer. She looked professional, competent. She could do this. The front porch creaked slightly under her feet as she approached the door. Before she could knock, it opened to reveal a man who looked to be in his early 40s, tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that needed cutting. His jeans were faded and his work shirt had seen better days, but there was something about the way he carried himself that suggested quiet confidence. "You must be Sarah," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Joe Morgan. Thanks for driving all the way out here." His grip was firm but not crushing, and his brown eyes were direct but not unkind. Sarah had been prepared for either hostility or condescension, the way some men looked at women they didn't think could handle physical work. Instead, she saw curiosity and something that might have been cautious hope. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice," she said. "I know I'm not your typical ranch hand candidate." Joe smiled slightly, the expression transforming his serious face. "Well, let's talk about that. Want some coffee? I was just taking a break anyway." The kitchen was spacious but clearly functional rather than decorative. Practical white cabinets, a farmhouse sink, and a large table that looked like it had hosted decades of family meals. Joe poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that looked industrial strength and gestured for her to sit. "Tell me about yourself," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "What made you answer an ad for ranch work?" Sarah had rehearsed this moment during the drive, but sitting here in Joe Morgan's kitchen, the prepared speech disappeared. Instead, she found herself telling him the truth about losing her job, about the eviction notice, about Emma, and the responsibility of being a single mother with no family support. She told him about the months of rejection and the growing desperation that had led her to the library that morning. Joe listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking a clarifying question. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "I'll be honest with you, Sarah. Ranch work is hard. We're up before dawn most days, work in all kinds of weather. You'll be dealing with animals that outweigh you by 1,000 pounds. Machinery that can be dangerous if you're not careful. It's not what most people picture when they think about a job change." "I understand that," Sarah said, though she wasn't entirely sure she did. "But I'm not afraid of hard work. I may not have experience with cattle, but I learn fast, and I don't give up easily. The past 6 months have taught me that I'm stronger than I thought I was." "What about your daughter? Emma, right? How old is she?" "She's 8. And before you ask, yes. I've thought about this. She'd have to change schools, leave her friends. But honestly, Mr. Morgan, staying where we are isn't really an option anymore. At least here, she'd have stability. Room to run and play, clean air. Maybe some of the childhood I had in mind for her before everything fell apart. Joe stood and walked to the window that looked out over the pasture. A group of horses grazed near the fence line, their coats gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. The job comes with the foreman's cottage, he said without turning around. It's small, 2 bedrooms, but it's solid. Previous foreman was an older man who didn't need much space. There's a good elementary school in town, about 15 minutes down the road. Bus picks up right at the end of the driveway. Sarah felt her heart skip. He was talking about practicalities, which meant he was considering her seriously. The work itself. Joe continued, turning back to face her, starts with learning to handle the cattle. Basic animal husbandry, feeding schedules, recognizing signs of illness. You'd be working mostly with me at first, then gradually taking on more responsibility. We run about 500 head of beef cattle, plus the horses. It's a working ranch, which means every day is different depending on what needs doing. What happened to your previous ranch hand? Sarah asked. Tom retired last month. He'd been here 15 years, since my dad's time. Good man, but his arthritis was getting the better of him. He's the one who convinced me to hire someone new, instead of just trying to manage everything myself. Joe poured himself another cup of coffee, offering to refill hers. The thing is, Sarah, I need someone who's going to stick around. Training takes time and effort, and I can't afford to invest that in someone who's going to leave in 6 months for an office job in the city. I won't lie to you, Sarah said carefully. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be sitting in a ranch kitchen asking for a job working with cattle, I'd have thought they were crazy. But life has a way of changing your perspective. I'm not running away from anything anymore, Mr. Morgan. I'm looking for a place to build something better for my daughter and myself. They talked for another hour, Joe explaining the daily routines, the seasonal cycles of ranch life, the challenges and rewards of working with animals and land. Sarah asked questions about everything from veterinary care to equipment operation, taking mental notes and trying to picture herself doing this work. Finally, Joe stood up. Come on, let me show you around. You should see what you'd be getting yourself into. The tour started at the barn, a massive structure that housed everything from hay storage to a workshop filled with tools Sarah didn't recognize. The smell was earthy and organic, hay and leather and animals, nothing like the sterile office environment she was used to. Joe introduced her to the horses first, gentle giants that came to the fence when he called their names. This is Sage, he said, stroking the neck of a calm brown mare. She's our best cattle horse, smart as a whip and steady as a rock. Most of the cow work is done on horseback out here. I should probably tell you, I've never ridden a horse, Sarah admitted. That's what I figured, but don't worry about it. We'll start you on footwork first, get you comfortable around the animals. Riding comes later, when you're ready. They walked through the pastures, Joe pointing out different groups of cattle and explaining the basics of herd management. The animals were bigger than Sarah had imagined, but they seemed peaceful enough, content to graze and pay little attention to the humans walking among them. The cottage that would be her home sat about a quarter mile from the main house, a neat little building with yellow siding and a small front porch. Joe unlocked the door and showed her through rooms that were simple but clean. The living room had large windows that looked out over the pasture, and the kitchen was small but functional. The bedrooms were modest, but Sarah could already picture Emma's stuffed animals arranged on the smaller bed, her drawings taped to the walls. It's not fancy, Joe said, but it's comfortable. Comes furnished with the basics, utilities included. Standing in that little cottage, Sarah could feel something settling into place inside her chest. It wasn't just shelter. It was possibility. A chance to start over, to give Emma the kind of childhood she herself had dreamed of but never experienced. What's the salary? She asked, though she'd almost forgotten that money wasn't everything. $35,000 a year, plus the cottage and utilities. Health insurance through the ranch policy. It's not going to make you rich, but with no housing costs, it goes further than you might think. It was less than she'd made at the insurance office, but Joe was right. Without rent, utilities, or most grocery costs, it might actually leave her better off than she'd been before losing her job. They walked back toward the main house. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that Sarah had never noticed from her apartment window, the peaceful lowing of cattle and the distant whinny of horses replaced the constant hum of traffic she'd grown so accustomed to. I have to ask, Sarah said as they reached her car, why are you even considering hiring me? Surely you had other applicants with actual ranch experience. Joe leaned against the porch railing, studying her face in the fading light. Truth? You're the only person who called. Ranch work isn't what it used to be. Most young people head for the city soon as they graduate high school. The ones who stay usually end up working for the bigger corporate operations that pay more than a family ranch like this can afford. He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. But there's something else. When you talked about your daughter, about wanting to give her stability and a good childhood, I heard something in your voice that reminded me of my mother. She wasn't born to ranch life either. Came here from Denver when she married my dad, didn't know a cow from a horse. But she learned, and she made this place into a real home. Sometimes the best ranch hands are the ones who choose this life because they see something in it, not just the ones who never knew anything else. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, though she couldn't say exactly why. Maybe it was relief, or hope, or just the simple kindness in his words. "When would you need an answer?" she asked. "Take the weekend," Joe said. "Think it over. Talk to your daughter. This is a big decision for both of you. If you decide you want to try it, you can start Monday. I'll be here to help you learn the ropes." And Tom said he'd come by the first few weeks to help with the transition. Driving home in the gathering darkness, Sarah's mind raced with everything she'd seen and heard. The practical part of her brain catalogued the challenges: learning to work with large animals, operating unfamiliar equipment, adjusting to a completely different lifestyle. But underneath the practical concerns, something deeper was stirring. For the first time in months, she'd spent an afternoon thinking about the future, instead of just surviving the present. She'd stood in a place where she could imagine herself belonging, where she could picture Emma running through fields and learning to ride horses, and growing up with the kind of freedom Sarah had never known was possible. The question wasn't whether she could do the work. The question was whether she had the courage to bet everything on a future so different from anything she'd ever imagined. But as she pulled into the parking lot of her apartment complex and saw the eviction notice still taped to her door, Sarah realized that the biggest risk might be staying exactly where she was. Emma was waiting by the window when Sarah pulled up to the apartment, her small face pressed against the glass. The sight of her daughter's eager expression made Sarah's chest tight with emotion. How could she explain that their entire world might be about to change? How could she ask an 8-year-old to leave everything familiar behind for a life neither of them had ever experienced? "Mama, you are gone forever," Emma exclaimed, launching herself into Sarah's arms as soon as she walked through the door. "Mrs. Patterson made mac and cheese for dinner, and she let me watch cartoons, but I missed you." Mrs. Patterson, their elderly neighbor, emerged from the kitchen wiping her hands on a dish towel. She'd been watching Emma during Sarah's job interviews for months now, refusing to accept payment despite her own limited income. "How did it go, dear?" she asked, her eyes full of hope and worry. Sarah looked from Mrs. Patterson's kind face to her daughter's trusting eyes and felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. "It's complicated," she said finally. "Let me get Emma some dinner, and then maybe we can talk." As Emma chatted about her day over leftover mac and cheese, Sarah tried to imagine explaining ranch life to her city-raised daughter. How do you tell a child who's never seen open countryside that you're considering moving to a place where the nearest neighbor is miles away? How do you make a cattle ranch sound appealing to someone whose idea of animals comes from picture books and the occasional squirrel in the apartment complex courtyard? After Emma was settled with her homework, Sarah and Mrs. Patterson sat at the small kitchen table with cups of tea that had grown cold, while Sarah recounted her afternoon at Morgan Ranch. "It sounds like a wonderful opportunity, Mrs. Domingle," Patterson said carefully. "But it's such a big change. Are you sure you're ready for something like this?" "I don't know if anyone's ever ready for a complete life change," Sarah admitted. "But I keep thinking about what the alternative is. We have less than a month before we're evicted. My unemployment is running out. I've applied for dozens of jobs and haven't gotten so much as an interview for anything that would cover our basic expenses." She stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the apartment complex parking lot. A group of teenagers had gathered under the broken streetlight, their voices carrying through the thin walls. In the distance, she could hear sirens and the constant hum of traffic. "When I was at the ranch today, Emma, standing in that little cottage and looking out over all that open space, I could picture her running and playing and just being a kid. Really being a kid, not growing up too fast in a place like this." "Mrs. Delaware," Patterson nodded slowly. "My grandmother grew up on a farm in Kansas. Used to tell me stories about gathering eggs and helping with harvest, about knowing every animal by name. She said it was the happiest time of her life, before the family moved to the city during the Depression." "But what if I can't do the work?" Sarah asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her since leaving the ranch. "What if I'm not strong enough, or smart enough, or just not cut out for that kind of life?" "Then you'll learn," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "You've already proven you can do hard things, Sarah."
You've kept yourself and Emma together through 6 months of struggle. That takes more strength than most people ever need to find.
That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah sat at her laptop searching for information about ranch life, about what it was really like to live and work in cattle country.
She read blogs written by ranch wives, articles about sustainable farming, forums where ranch hands discussed the realities of their work. The picture that emerged was both harder and more rewarding than she'd expected. The physical demands were real. Early mornings in all kinds of weather, heavy lifting, working with animals that could be unpredictable. But the people writing about this life described a satisfaction she'd never found in office work, a sense of purpose that came from caring for the land and animals, from being part of something larger than themselves. She found herself lingering on photos of children playing in pastures, of families gathered around kitchen tables in ranch houses, of sunrises over endless grassland. It was a different kind of life entirely, but maybe different was exactly what they needed. The weekend passed in a blur of practical preparations and emotional turmoil. Sarah made lists of what they'd need to pack, what they'd need to leave behind, what Emma would need for a new school. She called the ranch to ask about veterinary records for pets, only to remember with a pang that they'd never been able to afford a dog or cat in the apartment. On Sunday afternoon, she finally sat Emma down for the conversation she'd been dreading. "Baby, you know how Mum has been looking for a job?" Emma nodded solemnly. At 8, she understood more about their situation than Sarah liked to admit. "Well, I might have found something, but it would mean a big change for both of us." Sarah explained about the ranch as simply as she could, describing the animals and the wide open spaces, the little cottage that would be their new home, the school where Emma would make new friends. She tried to make it sound like an adventure rather than a desperate escape. Emma listened with the serious expression she wore when processing important information. When Sarah finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Would there be horses?" she asked finally. "Yes, sweetheart. Real horses that you could learn to ride. And cows? Lots of cows. And maybe other animals too." Emma's eyes lit up with the first genuine excitement Sarah had seen in months. "Could we get a dog?" "You always said we couldn't have a dog here because there's no yard." Sarah felt her heart clench. "We'd have to ask Mr. Morgan, but I think there's a good chance we could get a dog." "When would we go?" The simple question held so much trust, so much faith in Sarah's ability to make the right decision. Emma wasn't asking if they should go. She was asking when. Despite all the uncertainty and change that had marked her young life, she still believed that her mother would take care of her, would make choices that led to good things. "If we do this, we'd go tomorrow." "I'd start work on Monday." Emma nodded as if major life changes were just part of growing up. "Can I pack my stuffed animals?" "Of course, baby. You can pack everything that's important to you." That evening, as they folded Emma's clothes and toys into boxes, Sarah felt a strange mixture of terror and excitement. She was about to take the biggest gamble of her life, betting everything on her ability to learn a completely foreign job in a completely foreign environment. But for the first time in months, she wasn't just running away from something. She was running towards something. She called Joe Morgan that night, her hands shaking as she dialed the number. "Morgan Ranch." "Mr. Morgan, this is Sarah Martinez. I've made my decision about the job." "I'm listening." "I'd like to accept if the offer is still open. We can be there tomorrow." There was a pause, and Sarah could hear the sound of dogs barking in the background. "I'm glad to hear that, Sarah. I think you're making a good choice." "You sure you're ready for this?" "No," she said honestly. "I'm not sure at all, but I'm ready to try." Joe's chuckle was warm and reassuring. "Sometimes that's all you need to start with. Come on out whenever you're ready tomorrow. I'll be here." The moving process was simpler than Sarah had expected, mainly because they owned so little of value. She'd sold most of their furniture months ago, and what remained fit easily into her car and a small rental trailer. Mrs. Patterson helped them pack, pressing a container of homemade cookies into Emma's hands and promising to visit once they were settled. "You're brave," she told Sarah as they loaded the last box. "Braver than you know." The drive to the ranch on Monday morning felt like a journey to another world. Emma chatted excitedly about the horses and dogs and all the space they'd have to explore, while Sarah tried to calm her nerves and focus on the road ahead. The landscape that had seemed foreign just days before now looked welcoming, full of possibility. Joe was waiting for them at the cottage, along with an older man Sarah recognized as Tom, the retiring foreman. They helped unload the car and trailer, Tom regaling Emma with stories about the ranch animals, while Joe showed Sarah around the cottage again, this time pointing out practical details like the propane tank and the well water system. School doesn't start until 8:30, Joe said as they stood in the little kitchen. Bus comes by at 7:45. I usually start work around 6, but for the first few weeks, we'll ease you into it. Say 7:30 until you get your bearings. Sarah nodded, trying to memorize everything he was telling her. The cottage felt even smaller with their belongings scattered around in boxes, but it also felt like theirs in a way the apartment never had. Emma had discovered the window in her bedroom that looked directly out over the horse pasture and was calling excitedly for Sarah to come see. Standing beside her daughter, watching the horses graze in the morning sunshine, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the desperate calm that came from solving an immediate crisis, but real peace, the kind that comes from being in the right place, even when you don't know what comes next. Mama, look! Emma pressed her nose to the glass. That one has spots. Sarah followed her gaze to see a paint horse with brown and white patches standing near the fence. As they watched, the horse lifted its head and seemed to look directly at them, as if welcoming them to their new home. We'll have to ask Mr. Morgan what his name is, Sarah said, wrapping her arms around her daughter. Her name is Star, came a voice from the doorway. Joe stood there with Tom, both men smiling at Emma's excitement. She's gentle as a lamb and loves kids. Tom's granddaughter learned to ride on her. Could I learn too? Emma asked, turning to face them with shining eyes. I don't see why not, Joe said. But first you'll need to learn how to brush her and take care of her. Riding comes after you know how to be safe around horses. As the men helped them finish unpacking, Sarah felt the last of her reservations melting away. This was right. She didn't know how she knew it, but standing in this little cottage with her daughter already making plans to learn horseback riding, she knew they were finally home. The work would be hard, the learning curve steep, and there would probably be moments when she questioned everything about this decision. But looking out at the endless sky and feeling the peace that came with space to breathe and room to grow, Sarah Martinez knew she'd finally found the place where she and Emma belonged. Sarah's first morning as a ranch hand began at 5:30, when the sound of roosters crowing jolted her from a deep sleep. For a moment, she forgot where she was, reaching automatically for her phone to check the time before remembering that there was no snooze button on a ranch. The animals needed tending, regardless of how tired she felt. She dressed quickly in the work clothes Joe had recommended. Sturdy jeans, a long-sleeve shirt, and the pair of work boots she'd bought at the farm supply store in town. Emma was still sleeping soundly, her stuffed animals arranged around her in the new bed. Sarah left a note promising pancakes for breakfast and slipped quietly out of the cottage. The air was crisp and clean, carrying scents she was still learning to identify: hay, earth, and something sweet she thought might be wildflowers. The sun hadn't yet appeared over the eastern hills, but the sky was beginning to lighten, painting everything in soft shades of grey and gold. Joe was already in the barn when she arrived, moving efficiently between stalls, with a presence that spoke of decades of practice. He looked up when she entered, nodding approvingly at her punctuality. Morning, Sarah. Sleep well? Better than I have in months, she admitted, and realized it was true. Despite her nerves about the new job, she'd fallen asleep almost immediately in the quiet cottage, lulled by the absence of city noise. Good, that's the country air. Takes most people a few days to adjust to how quiet it is out here. Joe handed her a pair of work gloves. Ready for your first lesson? The morning routine was more complex than Sarah had imagined. They started with the horses, checking each animal for injuries or signs of illness, filling water troughs, and distributing hay. Joe showed her how to read the animal's body language, how to approach them safely, how to spot the subtle signs that something might be wrong. Horses are honest, he explained as they worked. They'll tell you exactly how they're feeling, but you have to know how to listen. See how Star's ears are forward when you approach? That means she's curious about you, not afraid. If her ears were pinned back, you'd want to be more careful. Sarah tried to absorb everything he was teaching her while fighting the natural nervousness that came from being close to such large animals. The horses seemed gentle enough, but their size was intimidating to someone who'd never been around anything bigger than a golden retriever. After the horses came the cattle, a much more complex operation. Joe drove them out to the pasture in his pickup truck, Sarah riding shotgun while trying to take mental notes about gates, water systems, and the seemingly endless details of livestock management. Cattle are different from horses, Joe explained as they checked the herd. They're herd animals through and through. Where one goes, the others follow. That can work for you or against you, depending on the situation. He pointed out individual animals, teaching her to recognize the signs of a healthy cow versus one that might need attention. See that black one there, standing apart from the others? We'll want to keep an eye on her. Could be nothing, but when a cow separates herself from the herd, it usually means something's not right. By the time they returned to the barn for lunch, Sarah felt like her brain was stuffed with information she wasn't sure she could retain. Feed schedules, vaccination records, breeding cycles, equipment maintenance. It was like learning a foreign language, except the consequences of misunderstanding could involve 1,000-pound animals. Emma bounced off the school bus that afternoon, full of stories about her new teacher and classmates. The rural school was smaller than her previous one, with only 15 students in her grade. But she'd already made friends with a girl named Katie, whose family owned the neighboring ranch. "Katie has her own horse, Mama," Emma reported as they walked to the cottage together. "And she said maybe I could come over and see him sometime." "Can I?" "Please." "We'll have to ask Katie's parents and Mr. Tom, Morgan," Sarah said, still adjusting to the idea that her daughter was now talking about horses as casually as she'd once talked about playground equipment. That evening, as they sat on their little porch eating dinner and watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible shades of orange and pink, Sarah felt a contentment she'd forgotten was possible. Emma was chattering about her day, pointing out different animals in the pasture, and asking endless questions about ranch life. For the first time in months, her daughter seemed truly happy. The learning curve was steep, and there were moments during those first weeks when Sarah wondered if she'd bitten off more than she could chew. On her 5th day, she accidentally left a gate unlatched, allowing 6 steers to wander into the wrong pasture. Joe spent an hour helping her round them up, patiently explaining proper gate protocol while she fought back tears of embarrassment. "Everyone makes mistakes," he said as they secured the last steer back where it belonged. "The key is learning from them and not making the same one twice." His kindness in the face of her errors meant more than he probably knew. Sarah had grown accustomed to criticism and impatience from supervisors in her previous jobs. But Joe seemed genuinely invested in her success, rather than looking for reasons to find fault. Tom stopped by regularly during her first month, sharing decades of wisdom about everything from weather patterns to animal behavior. He was a walking encyclopedia of ranch knowledge, able to predict storms by the way the cattle grouped together, and diagnose illness from subtle changes in an animal's posture. "Joe's a good boss," he told Sarah one afternoon as they worked together to repair a section of fence. "Fair, hard-working, honest." His father was the same way. "This ranch has been in good hands for 3 generations. What's he like when he's not being patient with the new employee who doesn't know anything?" Sarah asked, curious about the man who'd taken such a chance on her. Tom chuckled. "Pretty much the same. Joe doesn't put on airs. What you see is what you get. He works harder than anybody, treats his animals well, and takes care of the people who work for him. Lost his wife in a car accident about 5 years ago. They never had kids. Think he's been a little lonely out here since then." The information explained something Sarah had noticed about Joe, a quiet sadness that sometimes shadowed his eyes when he thought no one was looking. She found herself wondering what his wife had been like, whether she'd loved ranch life or simply endured it for his sake. As autumn progressed into winter, Sarah's confidence grew along with her skill set. She learned to drive the ranch truck, to operate the hay mower, to give injections to cattle that needed medical treatment. Her hands, once soft from office work, developed calluses and strength. Her body, initially sore from unaccustomed physical labor, adapted and grew stronger. Emma was thriving in ways Sarah had never imagined possible. The shy, anxious child who'd worried constantly about their uncertain future was transforming into an adventurous little girl who came home every day with stories about barn cats and baby calves and the endless wonders of ranch life. Katie's family had indeed welcomed her visits, and she was learning to ride under the supervision of Katie's mother, who'd been riding since childhood. "I think Star likes me best," Emma confided to Sarah one evening as they watched the horses in the pasture. "She always comes to the fence when she sees me, and Joe says she follows me around like a puppy." Sarah had to agree. The gentle paint horse seemed genuinely fond of her daughter, often approaching the cottage fence in the evenings as if hoping for a visit. Joe had started allowing Emma to help with Star's grooming under close supervision, teaching her the proper way to brush the horse's coat and pick out her hooves. It was during one of these grooming sessions that Sarah realized how much her relationship with Joe had evolved beyond simple employer and employee. She was watching from the cottage porch as he patiently guided Emma through the steps of preparing Star for a ride when she noticed the genuine affection in his voice, the care he took to ensure Emma felt safe and confident. He'd become more than just her boss over these months. He was the person who made sure they had everything they needed, who took time to answer Emma's endless questions about ranch life, who never made Sarah feel foolish for not knowing something that seemed obvious to someone raised in this world. When a late November snowstorm knocked out power to the cottage for 2 days, Joe had insisted they stay in the main house until the electricity was restored. Sarah had protested that they'd be fine with the fireplace and battery-powered lanterns, but he'd overruled her with quiet authority. "No point in you and Emma being cold and uncomfortable when there's plenty of room here," he'd said, and that had been the end of the discussion. Those 2 days had given Sarah a glimpse into Joe's private world, the life he lived in the sprawling ranch house that had been his family's home for generations. Family photos lined the mantelpiece, showing 3 generations of Morgans who'd worked this land. His wife Linda smiled from several pictures, a pretty blonde woman with kind eyes who looked like she belonged in this setting. Emma had been fascinated by everything, asking to see old photo albums and hear stories about the ranch's history. Joe had patiently explained how his great-grandfather had started with 40 acres and 2 cows, building the operation slowly over decades of hard work and careful management. "Will you have kids to take over the ranch someday?" Emma asked with the directness only children could manage. Joe's expression had grown thoughtful. "I don't know, sweetheart. I hope so. This place has been in my family for a long time, and I'd hate for that to end with me." Later, after Emma was asleep on the couch under a pile of quilts, Sarah and Joe sat by the fire drinking coffee and talking quietly about everything and nothing. It was the first time they'd had a real conversation unrelated to work, and Sarah found herself genuinely enjoying his company. He was intelligent and well-read despite never having gone to college, with a dry sense of humor and strong opinions about everything from politics to the best way to train a cutting horse. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked during a comfortable pause in their conversation. "Staying here instead of seeing what else was out there?" Joe was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if she'd overstepped some boundary. But finally he spoke, his voice thoughtful in the firelight. "I left once. Right after high school, went to Denver for a year. Thought I wanted to see what city life was all about." He smiled ruefully. "Lasted 8 months before I came home with my tail between my legs. Turned out I wasn't made for concrete and crowds. This land gets in your blood, Sarah. Once it does, everywhere else feels like playing pretend." Looking around the warm, comfortable room with its well-worn furniture and family photographs, Sarah could understand what he meant. There was something about this place, this life, that felt real in a way her previous existence never had. It was hard work, but it was honest work. It was simple, but not easy, and every day brought small satisfactions that she'd never found in an office cubicle. By December, Sarah had stopped thinking of herself as someone who was learning ranch work, and started thinking of herself as a ranch hand who was still learning. The distinction was subtle but important. She belonged here now, and not just because Joe had given her a chance. She belonged because she'd earned her place through sweat and determination, and the kind of bone-deep satisfaction that came from doing work that mattered. Christmas was approaching, and with it came the question of what traditions to maintain and what new ones to create in their changed circumstances. Emma had already announced her intention to ask Santa for riding boots and a cowboy hat, her priorities having shifted dramatically from toys to tools of her new lifestyle. Sarah found herself looking forward to their first Christmas at the ranch, with an anticipation she hadn't felt about anything in years. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever lessons she still needed to learn, she knew they'd found something precious in this place. They'd found home. The Christmas blizzard arrived 3 days before the holiday, dumping 2 feet of snow across the ranch and trapping everyone indoors for the better part of a week. Sarah had never experienced a real winter storm before, and watching the world disappear under a blanket of white while the wind howled around the cottage was both terrifying and exhilarating. Joe checked on them every few hours during the worst of it, trudging through knee-deep snow to make sure their heat was working and they had enough food. On the second day, when Emma complained of being bored despite having every board game and coloring book they owned spread across the living room floor, he arrived with a box of his childhood books and a jigsaw puzzle that depicted a summer scene of the very pasture they could barely see through their snow-covered windows. "Figured you might be getting cabin fever," he said, stamping snow off his boots just inside the door. His cheeks were red from cold and his hair was dusted with snowflakes, and Sarah felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude for his thoughtfulness. "You didn't have to come all the way over here in this weather," she protested, though she was secretly glad he had. The storm had made her realize how isolated they were, how dependent they'd become on his presence and guidance. "Course I did. Can't have my best ranch hand and her daughter going stir-crazy." Emma looked up from where she was attempting to sort puzzle pieces by color. "Are we really your best ranch hands? Even me?" Joe's expression grew serious, the way it did when he was about to say something he wanted her to remember. Emma, you know more about taking care of Star than some adults know about horses, and your mama here has learned more in 6 months than most people learn in 2 years. So yeah, you're my best ranch hands. The compliment warmed Sarah more than the wood stove heating their little cottage. In the months since she'd started working at the ranch, she'd grown increasingly aware that her feelings for Joe had evolved beyond simple gratitude and professional respect. He was kind without being patronizing, strong without being domineering, and patient in ways that spoke to a fundamental decency of character. But she'd also grown aware of the careful boundaries he maintained, the way he kept their relationship firmly within professional limits despite the increasing frequency of shared meals and evening conversations. She told herself it was natural, that he was her employer and needed to maintain appropriate distance. She told herself that a man like Joe, with deep roots in this community and this way of life, would hardly be interested in a relationship with someone who'd stumbled into ranch work by accident. The storm finally broke on Christmas Eve morning, revealing a world transformed by snow that sparkled like diamonds in the sunshine. The work of digging out began immediately, with Joe operating the tractor to clear the driveways while Sarah and Emma shoveled paths between the buildings. It was hard, cold work, but there was something festive about it, something that made even the labor feel like part of the holiday celebration. That evening, Joe invited them to the main house for Christmas Eve dinner, a tradition his family had maintained for decades. Sarah had been hesitant to accept, unsure about intruding on what seemed like a private observance. But Joe had insisted. "House is too big and too quiet for one person on Christmas Eve," he said. "Besides, Emma's been asking to see the rest of the photo albums." The dinner was simple but perfect. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans from the garden that Joe's grandmother had canned the previous summer. They ate by candlelight at the old oak table that had served the Morgan family for 3 generations, Emma chattering excitedly about her plans for Christmas morning while the adults listened and smiled. After dinner, they moved to the living room where a fire crackled in the stone fireplace and a modest Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with ornaments that clearly held decades of family history. Joe produced the photo albums Emma had requested, and they spent the evening looking at pictures of Christmases past, Joe sharing stories about his parents and grandparents and the traditions that had shaped his childhood. "This was my mum's favorite ornament," he said, pointing to a delicate glass angel near the top of the tree. "She always said angels watched over ranches because they needed extra protection in the middle of nowhere." Sarah studied the ornament, thinking about the woman who'd placed it there year after year, who'd made this house a home for her family. "She sounds like she was wonderful." She was. Dad always said she could make Christmas magical even when money was tight. She'd have liked you, I think. And she'd have loved Emma. The comment hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither of them seemed ready to address directly. Sarah felt her cheeks warm and was grateful for the dim lighting that hopefully hid her reaction. Emma fell asleep on the couch sometime after 10 o'clock, curled up with one of Joe's old dogs, and covered by a quilt his great-grandmother had made. Sarah started to wake her, but Joe shook his head. "Let her sleep. I'll carry her over to the cottage in the morning." They sat quietly by the fire, listening to the wind whistle around the house and the occasional creak of settling timbers. The silence was comfortable rather than awkward, the kind that existed between people who'd grown used to each other's presence. "Sarah," Joe said finally, his voice quiet in the firelit room. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded, though her heart rate picked up slightly at his serious tone. "Do you ever think about what comes next? I mean, long term? You've been here 6 months now, and you're good at this work. Better than good. But I sometimes wonder if you see this as permanent or just a stepping stone to something else." The question she'd been dreading had finally come, and Sarah realized she'd been avoiding thinking about it because the answer had become complicated in ways she hadn't expected. "When I first came here," she said carefully, "I thought I was just buying time. Thought I'd learn the work, save some money, and eventually find my way back to something more like my old life. But the truth is, I can't imagine that anymore. This place has changed me. Changed Emma. We're different people than we were 6 months ago." Joe nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the fire. "Different how?" Sarah considered the question, searching for words to explain what felt too big and too new to articulate properly. Stronger, maybe. More connected to something real. Emma was anxious all the time in the city, worried about things she was too young to understand. Here, she's just a kid again. She's confident and happy, and growing up with the kind of childhood I always wished I could give her. And you? I feel like I finally know who I am. Not just someone trying to survive, or someone defined by what I've lost, but someone who belongs somewhere, who has something valuable to contribute. She paused, then added more quietly, someone who has a future to look forward to, instead of just problems to solve. Joe was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah wondered if she'd revealed too much, crossed some line by making it clear that her feelings about staying had as much to do with him as with the work. "I've been thinking too," he said finally, "about the future, about what I want the next chapter of my life to look like. This ranch has been in my family for 3 generations, but it's always been more than just a business to us. It's been a home, a place where families grow and thrive. Since Linda died, it's felt more like just a business, like something was missing." He turned to look at her then, his expression serious but warm in the firelight. "These past months, watching you and Emma here, seeing how you've taken to this life, how Emma's blossomed, how you've made that little cottage into a real home, it's reminded me what was missing. It's reminded me that a ranch without a family is just land and buildings." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Was he saying what she thought he was saying? "Joe, I'm not asking for any promises," he said quickly. "I know this is all still new for you, and I don't want to pressure you into anything. But I want you to know that when I think about the future of this ranch, when I think about who I want to share it with, I think about you and Emma. You're not just employees here, you're family. And if you're willing, if you think you might want to build something permanent here, I'd like to explore what that might look like." The words hung in the air between them, full of possibility and promise. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally hearing her own feelings reflected back to her. "I'd like that too," she whispered. "I'd like that very much." Joe's smile was soft and genuine, transforming his usually serious face. "Good. That's really good." They talked until nearly dawn, sharing hopes and dreams and practical considerations about what combining their lives might mean. They talked about Emma's future, about the ranch's future, about the careful process of building something real and lasting together. There were no dramatic declarations or grand gestures, just 2 people who'd found each other in an unexpected place, making plans for a future that felt both thrilling and absolutely right. Christmas morning brought squeals of delight from Emma, as she discovered that Santa had indeed brought riding boots and a cowboy hat, along with a collection of books about horses and a hand-carved wooden horse that Joe admitted he'd made in his workshop during the long winter evenings. "It looks just like Star," Emma exclaimed, hugging the carved horse to her chest. "Did you really make this?" "My grandfather taught me woodworking," Joe explained. "Figured it was time I made something special for someone special." The rest of the day passed in a blur of cooking together in Joe's kitchen, playing in the snow, and establishing the foundation of what would become their new family traditions. Emma seemed to sense the shift in the relationship between the adults, though she was too young to fully understand what it meant. All she knew was that the 2 people she'd come to love most in her new life were happy, and that was enough for her. Spring brought new challenges and new joys. Sarah officially moved from the foreman's cottage to the main house in March, after she and Joe had a long conversation with Emma about what it would mean for their family to become official. Emma's response was to ask if she could finally get the puppy she'd been wanting, since there was definitely room for a dog in the big house. The wedding took place in June, on a perfect day when the wildflowers were blooming across the pastures, and the sky was the kind of endless blue that only existed in Big Sky country. It was a small ceremony held in the backyard of the ranch house with Emma as maid of honor and Tom serving as best man. Mrs. Hurt Patterson drove up from the city, tears streaming down her face as she watched Sarah promise to love and honor the man who'd given her and Emma a second chance at happiness. "I always knew you were brave," she whispered to Sarah as they hugged after the ceremony. "But I never knew you were this brave." As autumn approached, marking a full year since Sarah had first driven down the ranch's gravel driveway with nothing but desperation and hope, she found herself standing on the front porch of her new home, watching Emma and Joe work together to bring the horses in for the evening. Emma's riding had progressed to the point where she could help with simple ranch tasks, and her confidence around the animals was something to behold. The financial struggles that had once kept Sarah awake at night were a memory now, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of work well done, and a future that stretched ahead full of promise. The ranch was thriving under their combined efforts, Joe's experience and her fresh perspective, creating a partnership that strengthened every aspect of the operation. But more than that, they'd created something neither of them had dared to hope for when they'd first met in his kitchen over coffee and cautious conversation. They'd created a family, a real home, a life built on mutual respect and shared dreams, and the kind of love that grew slowly and deeply, like the roots of the cottonwood trees that shaded the ranch house. Emma came running up to the porch, her cheeks flushed from the cool evening air and her eyes bright with excitement. "Mama, Joe says maybe next year I can help with the cattle drive. Do you think I'll be ready?" Sarah looked at her daughter, this confident, happy child, who bore little resemblance to the anxious little girl who'd once worried about everything beyond her control, and felt her heart swell with pride and gratitude.
"I think you'll be ready for anything, sweetheart. Anything at all." As the three of them stood together on the porch, watching the sun set over the land that had become their legacy and their future, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them here.
It had started with desperation and a newspaper ad with a willingness to risk everything on an impossible dream. But it had become something so much larger and more beautiful than anything she could have imagined. Sometimes the best things in life really did come when you were brave enough to step into the unknown, to trust that the future held better things than what you were leaving behind. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you found that the person willing to take a chance on you was also the person you were meant to spend the rest of your life loving. The ranch spread out before them in the gathering twilight, peaceful and prosperous and full of promise for all the tomorrows yet to come.